Hey, in this video, I'm going to teach you on the pronunciation on how to reduce the word and. Alright, so we have here Mr. and Mrs. Ali. Mr. and Mrs. Björk. You and Pam. Jim and Ben. So, how we're going to read it, or how are we going to say it to sound like a natural English speaker? Here, reducing and, we have to omit the sound of A and D. So what we have here left is the N sound. So this is how we're going to pronounce Mr. and Mrs. Ali. We just have to sound the N instead of and. We can say Mr. and Mrs. Ali. Mr. and Mrs. Björk. You and Pam. Jim and Ben. Mr. and Mrs. Ali. Mr. and Mrs. Björk. You and Pam. Jim and Ben. I'm going to give you another example and you have to read it yourself. I'll give you time and after that I'm going to read it for you. Here are some of the examples that you can practice. Great job! Okay, so this is how we're going to read them. Mr. and Mrs. Barry, Mr. and Mrs. Lee, you and I, Walter and William. Again, you have to omit the sound of A and D. Just pronounce the N sound. Again, Mr. and Mrs. Barry, Mr. and Mrs. Lee, you and I, Walter and William. One more time. Mr. and Mrs. Barry, Mr. and Mrs. Lee, you and I, Walter and William.